Very good afternoon to everybody. Thank you once again for logging in to the session today. Just before we start our session, just to baseline everyone, the session today is being recorded as always. Your microphone will be muted. At the end of the presentation, you can raise your question by using the raise hand option and we will unmute you. Or as we present, you can actually continuously put your questions in the chat box, and looking at our time, we will come back to you to respond to your questions. You can also ask us more questions if you have further questions even after the sessions by emailing us at research@ub.edu.bs. So as you are aware, this UB Research Essentials series is a session that we have been organizing over the past few weeks and held every Tuesdays and Fridays. The main aim of this session is to assist all researchers at UB and outside UB in their knowledge and skills in executing good research projects and well-structured publication. These sessions will also assist students who have intention to continue their studies at the graduate program level. We at UB have just launched the MBA program, and more programs are coming soon as well. So the MBA program is already launched for the fall semester. So you can actually contact us to get more details. So this session will actually be ideal for all potential students who want to continue at the graduate level, or even not just at the graduate level, but to write good publication. So the session today, 26th of May, is very much focused on the methodology. We've already completed a series of sessions before the methodology, right? Focusing on the topic, abstract writing, introduction, the literature review. Today, we're going to focus a bit more on the methodology. There's going to be a lot of details in the session today. So although we may be going a bit fast, but you will be provided with the slides for you to actually run through and look at some of the links and the references that we've given so that you can enhance your knowledge if you need more information about this the session that we're going to be doing today. So without further ado, let me start off the session, the first part of the session, before I hand over the session to Ms. Ballance, Engineer Ballance. Okay, as I've said, the focus of the session today is to talk about the methodology part of writing your publication. So when you talk about the methodology here, the first part is basically to give you a quick overview of what methodology is all about and what are the things that you should put into the methodology. And then I'm going to go to the second part of the presentation, which is very much focusing on two types of research method, the quantitative research and the qualitative research. I will focus a bit more on the quantitative research part, and Ms. Ballance will actually focus on the qualitative research. So let's begin now. The method section is important for most researcher who wants to adopt or adapt your methodology. So when they read your paper, they look at your method. Why? They want to see whether they can actually do similar studies. Hence, the validity of the study can be determined by understanding if the method is correct or flawed. So the method, in essence, talks about how the data is collected, generated, and how was it analyzed. So good method is important. Readers need to know how the data was obtained, because the method you choose affects the results and how you likely interpreted those results. Methodology is crucial for any branch of scholarship because an unreliable method produces unreliable results and it misappropriates interpretations of findings. In most cases, there are a variety of different methods you can choose to investigate a research problem. Your methodology section of your paper should make it clear the reason why you chose a particular method or procedure. The reader wants to know that the data was collected or generated in a way that is consistent with acceptable practice in the field of study. For example, if you're using a questionnaire, readers need to know that it offered your respondents a reasonable range of answers to choose from. The research method must be appropriate to the objectives of the study. For example, be sure you have a large enough sample size to be able to generalize and make recommendations based upon the findings. The methodology should also discuss the problems that were anticipated and the steps you took to prevent them from occurring. For any problem that did arise, you must describe the ways in which their impact was minimized or why these problems do not affect the findings in any way that impact the interpretation of the data. So it is useful for other researchers to adapt or replicate your methodology. Therefore, it is important to always provide sufficient information. An effectively written methodology section should introduce the overall methodological approach for investigating your research problem. Is your study qualitative or quantitative or a combination of both, mixed method? Are you going to take special approach? Are you going to use some experimental method? Is it an action research? So what kind of method are you going to use? Indicate how the approach fits the overall research design. Your method should have a clear connection with your research problem. In other words, make sure that your methods will actually address the problem. One of the most common deficiency found in research papers is that the proposed method is unsuited to achieving the standard objective of your paper. Next, describe the specific methods of data collection you are going to use, such as survey, interview, questionnaire, or observation. So if you are analyzing existing data, such as a data set or archival document, describe how it was originally created or gathered and by whom. Explain how you intend to analyze your result. Are you planning to use statistical analysis? Will you use specific theoretical perspective to help you analyze a text or explain observed behaviors? Provide background and rationale for methodologies that are unfamiliar for your readers. Very often, if you see in social sciences, research problems and the method for investigating them require more explanation and rationale than widely accepted rules if you look at comparing to natural and physical sciences. So be clear and concise in your explanation. Next, provide a rationale for subject selection and sampling procedures. For instance, if you propose to conduct interviews, how do you intend to select the sample population? If you're analyzing text, which text have you chosen and why? If you are using statistics, why is this set of statistics being used? If other data sources exist, explain why the data was chosen. If you're using an experimental method, why you have chosen such method. Address potential limitations. Are there any practical limitations that could affect your data collection? How will you attempt to control this limitation? If your methodology may lead to problems you can anticipate, then state it right at the beginning in the methodology. Once you have written all of the elements of the method section, subsequent revision should focus on how to present those elements as clearly and as logically as possible. The description of how you prepared to study the research problem, how you gathered the data, and the protocol of analyzing the data should be organized chronologically. So this is very critical. Also take note of the following: irrelevant details. The methodology section of your paper should be thorough, but to the point. Don't provide any background information that doesn't directly help the reader to understand why a particular method was chosen, or how the data was gathered or obtained, or how it was analyzed. Unnecessary explanation of basic procedure is not needed. Remember that you are not writing a how-to guide about a particular method. You should make the assumption that the readers possess basic understanding of how to investigate the research problem on their own, and therefore you do not have to go into great details about specific methodological procedures. Unless, of course, you are writing a dissertation, then you tend to put in the details. The focus should be on how you apply the method, not on the mechanics of doing a method. So remember that always. Problem blindness. It is almost a given that you will encounter problems when collecting or generating your data. Do not ignore these problems or pretend they did not occur. Often, documenting how you overcame obstacles can form an interesting part of the methodology. Literature review. Just as the literature review section of your paper, which we discussed in the last session, the literature review section of your paper will provide an overview of sources you have examined while researching a particular topic. The same goes in the methodology section as well. So what sort of method that you have chosen? There are a lot of literature that supports that. So you have to actually mention that as well in your paper. So if you look, there are two different types of research method that is widely used. If you look at these two diagrams here, it shows the clear difference between a quantitative approach and a qualitative approach. Okay, so I'm sure you are both aware of the difference. So if you look at the main difference here is the quantitative research method is basically to test a particular theory. You already have a theory and now you're trying to prove the theory. So it uses a deductive approach and it uses a lot of numbers. Whereas the qualitative approach is basically creating a theory. So this is an inductive approach. So the tendency is you tend to use a lot of numbers, words. You use a lot of words, text-based. You may use images. So a lot of qualitative approach in carrying out the study. So there are differences, and whichever field that you are in, you can decide which is the best method for you, or even you can decide on a mixed method. So you have partially using a quantitative approach and partially using a qualitative approach. Most people tend to start with a qualitative to get the theory, and once the theory has been formed, then they test the theory by using a quantitative approach. So that is another way of actually carrying out the study. So when you have the time, please go through this table. The details about the difference between these two is stated very clearly here. So let's look at the quantitative research method now. So if you look at the quantitative research method, by now you already know that a quantitative method emphasizes on objective measurement and numerical analysis of data. These data are collected using various quantitative research tools like through polls, questionnaire, or survey. The main focus here is gathering numerical data and generalizing it across groups of people, while ensuring the respondents' feedback is a good representation of the actual population. The main goals in quantitative research is to determine the relationship between one thing and another, an independent variable versus the dependent variable, or sometimes you call it the outcome variable. And all these variables sometimes can also be impacted by other kind of variables. You have the moderating variables and the mediating variables. So these variables can actually determine the relationship between two variables that you are studying on. Quantitative research design can be descriptive, where the subjects are usually measured once, whereas if you're using an experimental method, the subjects are measured before and after a treatment, and you may even have a control. A descriptive study establishes only associations between variables and experiment. And if you're using an experimental method, it establishes the causality. So the focus of quantitative research deals in numbers, logic, and convergent reasoning rather than divergent reasoning. So remember why? Why do I say that? That's because you are testing the theory in quantitative research. Other characteristics of quantitative research include, firstly, the use of a structured research instrument like questionnaires, or use of certain equipment to collect numerical data, especially when you are carrying out experimental design type of research. You also need larger sample size that are representative of the population that is being studied. Next, the study should be able to be replicated or repeated. If someone uses the same method, it should be able to replicate the whole study. Clearly defined research question must be the guidance for you throughout the study. So if you have a good research question in place, then you are able to actually generate good measurement tools. All aspects of the study are carefully designed before data is collected. Data are in the form of numbers and statistics. The study can also generalize concepts, predict future results, or investigate the causal relationship, especially in experimental design. Generally, the aim is to classify the features, to count them, and to construct a statistical model to explain what is being observed. That is basically what a quantitative research method does. For the basic research design for any quantitative study, firstly, you need to decide the basic design by determining if it is going to be a descriptive study or experimental design before you strategize your data collection, your analysis, and even the interpretation of the result. So a descriptive study, as what I've said, it basically measures a particular subject once. Okay, if you're doing an interview, a survey questionnaire, you get a respondent only answering once, and then you try to find the relationship between this variable and try to generalize your finding to the sample population. Whereas in an experimental design, you tend to measure before and after a treatment is done, and then see the intended whether the study have actually established a causality between the variables that is being studied on. Now let us look at writing the methodology section of a quantitative study. In the introduction of the methodology section, include the following. Identify the research problem. As I've said, research problem is critical. How is this particular method addressing the research problem? So it has to be very clear. Review the literature. What is the literature telling about the particular method that is being adopted? Is this something new, or is this something common, or are you introducing a new approach in the same data set that you have seen people are using across the globe? Describe the theoretical framework. How is this methodology supporting the framework that is underpinning your study? So this is also important for you. In your method, it is also important for you to mention how each objective will be achieved in the study. So sufficient details like study population, sampling, data collection approach, and data analysis used for the study must be discussed. If you are writing a journal article, normally it has to be very precise when you write this methodology part. But if you are working on your dissertation, whether at the undergraduate level or graduate level, more details needs to be added for this section. Okay, for the following slides, I am going to focus on how quantitative and qualitative research studies are presented, discussed, and concluded. Although the results section is not written in the method section, since we are discussing a quantitative study, I think it is good for me to briefly discuss how the result of quantitative study can be presented. So Ms. Ballance afterward will actually talk to you about how you present a qualitative research study. So quantitative research results are presented using graphs, table, charts, and other non-textual elements. Statistical analyses are presented logically and sequentially. You have to describe your data in when you carry out quantitative study, but do not directly interpret unless you have a separate result and a discussion session. If the results section and the discussion section are put together for quantitative research, when you interpret, you have to actually interpret the data by just not reading it, but reading it and interpreting it. What it means, what does the data basically tell you. So be selective what data you are reporting and how you are reporting. Detailed, extensive tables can appear in the appendices. Okay, so you tend to get sidetracked when you use certain statistical software because you get a lot of tables and a lot of data being generated. So you got to decide what is critical for this study. Tables are better than graphs for giving structured numeric information. Graphs are better for demonstrating trends, making comparison or showing relationships. Text alone should not be used to convey more than 3 or 4 numbers. So when you write the analysis, sets of numerical results should usually be presented as tables or figures rather than included in the text. In the text, when you write numbers less than or equal to 9 should be written as words, while numbers from 10 upwards, normally we write it in digits. When decimal numbers are quoted, the number of significant digits should be consistent. So generally, 1 point past the decimal point is sufficient. Tables and graphs should be self-explanatory. The text should always include or mention of the key points in the table or figures. If a table does not warrant any discussion, it should not be there. So don't just put a table for the sake of having a table, but you never reference it. Statistical information beyond means and frequency, example, the standard deviation, the p-values, the t-values, are usually required in most formal scientific papers, but may not be necessary if you are writing for a general readership. So how you report will be different for different publication. Although you have used the same method, it's still a quantitative research method, but what kind of data that you want to report will depend on the publication and will depend on who is going to read this. So examples, we see these next few slides here that I'm going to quickly run through. It shows how you can use the different non-textual elements to actually present your data. So most of these are self-explanatory, so you are able to run through these in details after your session. So you can have pie charts, a 3D chart and a 2D chart. You can easily do this in most applications, especially in Excel. You can also arrange the charts. You can sort it based on in ascending or descending order, or you can actually unsort it and leave it as it is. So you have a control of how you want to present this data. You can use multiple pie graph, or you can actually put sets of pie charts together to actually analyze certain data. You can also combine multiple pie graph with a single bar graph. So this is another way to actually present the graph. So all these graphs that you use, if you notice, they are colored. So be very careful. If you are going to publish in a journal that is not using color in the first place, then you got to be very careful on the color that you use. Okay, you got to be playing with the grayscale, or you be playing with the pattern to ensure that the reader understands or can differentiate the various categories that you are presenting. So bar graph is another common graph that you always use in most quantitative research method. Again, just like the pie chart, you can sort it or you can unsort it. When you sort it, it goes in ascending or descending order, or you can leave it as it is. Bar charts can also be stacked. You can stack it up, or you can cluster it accordingly. So again, there is no right or wrong. It's how you want to present the data accordingly. Line graphs. So line graph is another common tool that we use a lot in quantitative research method, especially if you want to look at trends. So if it's a longitudinal study based on years, a period of year, a period of month or weeks, then it's always good to actually use line chart. So again, be very careful with the color, because if you are using grayscale, it can be very difficult to differentiate. So here you can actually use the different what do you call that, the points for each of the points. It can be a circle point, a triangular point, or even an outline point to differentiate the various measurement there, the various lines that you're using. So tables is another common that we always use. So tables is most effective way to present data for reference purpose. So it is good because most tables are self-explanatory. That is why normally if you're presenting the demographic data, it is always good to use a table, because at one go, when you look at the demographic of the research, it can be outlined very clearly in the table. So you don't need to have so many figures just to explain the demographic. You just need one table to explain everything. So tables can be broken down into different ways of how you want to present it. If you look at the two tables here, it's the same data, but it's presented differently. So you have an option how you want to present the data. Again, there are two different versions of the tables here, and look at how you can remove information or heading that are redundant and group them together to be more effective presentation. So if you look at all the graphs and figures that have been presented here, so you have to be very selective, making sure that the reader understands the data that's being presented, because quantitative research can be overwhelming if you have so many numbers. So the best way to actually present this data is by choosing the right table, right graphs to actually represent the figures. So for the discussion session of this methodology section, remember, it will differ from one publication to another, and you need to look at certain journals, what kind of, what is needed in the methodology section, what do you need to put in the methodology section, what kind of tables and figures that is allowed, how do you structure the table, also differs from one journal to another. So be very careful when you structure something. It is not standard all across. So the discussion part of the methodology section, okay, discussion should always be analytical, logical, comprehensive for all quantitative research, and it should meld together your findings in relation to those identified in the literature. So it should support your literature and place it within the context of the theoretical framework that is underpinning your study. Interpretation of result must keep reiterating the research problem. Remember, your guidance of this whole study is your research problem. Don't run away from your research problem. Description of trends, comparison of groups or relationship, any unanticipated findings or insignificant findings must be mentioned when you do a quantitative research. And then also discuss the meaning of your findings. Have you contributed to bridging the gaps of the study? That is why you're doing this study. Is there any limitation? Something, describe any unavoidable bias in your study. And when you end, conclusion part of it, to end your write-up for quantitative research analysis, ensure you summarize your key findings. Do not forget your research question. Have we tackled all the research questions that is required? Then, of course, you have the other part, the recommendation, future research, and the limitation. These are important, not as part of the methodology, but as part of your conclusion part of your section, which we will be doing in our next few sessions. But what I'm trying to show you here is if you're doing a quantitative research study, these are also critical information that must be picked up later when you do your conclusion. The limitation of the study, the specific limitation associated with using quantitative method to study research problem, especially if you look at social sciences, this may include information that are so critical for you. The first one, quantitative data may appear to be more efficient and able to test hypotheses, but sometimes may miss contextual details. So that is why in some cases, the tendency to use a mixed method approach and triangulate the findings. Use a static and rigid approach. So employ an inflexible process of discovery, because if you look at quantitative approach, it's very static. It is not flexible compared to the text-based qualitative approach, which you will hear from Ms. Ballance later. So these are, I'm just giving you some overview of the limitation. It is not a limitation of using it, but you got to keep that in your mind always. The development of standard questions by researcher can also lead to sometimes what we call a structural bias and false representation, where the data actually reflects the view of the researcher instead of the participating subject. Results also provide less detail on behavior, attitude, and motivation. If you look at in the current crisis that we are in, if you carry out a research now during the crisis period, the mindset of the respondent becomes important, because the response that you get may not be actually correct, because the mindset of the respondent is such now that his response seems to be different. The research is often carried out in an unnatural, artificial environment if you look at quantitative research. So this level of control might not normally be in place in the real world. So is the finding really valid? There's always a question. So this is always a debate that you see between the qualitative researcher versus the quantitative researcher. So preset answers in the questionnaire will not necessarily reflect how people really feel about a subject. So you need to always, why am I telling you all this limitation? Keep that in mind when you do your quantitative research and when you write your methodology, because these are the things that goes through people's mind. You don't want people to question your method, question your analysis. So you need to always put that in your mind. So that is basically to give you a quick snapshot of the methodology and the focus on a quantitative method. So now I'm going to hand over to Ms. Ballance to give you a snapshot about qualitative research method. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Vic, and good morning, everybody. The qualitative research method is different from quantitative. I'm not able to, okay, here we are. Let's start with the definition. It's defined as the systematic collection, organization, and interpretation of phenomena that are difficult to measure quantitatively. If we refer back to slide 12 or 13, quantitative research looks at numbers and is objective, whereas qualitative research methods analyze words, ideas, opinions, perceptions, experiences, and they are by that nature subjective. So the qualitative research emphasizes things that cannot be measured. It answers the why questions. It considers the reasons, the behaviors, opinions, and motivations, giving the researcher insight into a phenomena. For example, a business surveys its customers, and the data shows that most of the customers are men, not women, using their store, let's say. So they could interview women and ask them, why don't they come in, to delve deeper into the quantitative results. Qualitative research also focuses on how people perceive their reality. And as I say, it's subjective. And the researcher is indeed enmeshed in the method. They are not at arm's length as you are in a quantitative study. The inquiry is value-laden. It's subjective, whereas a quantitative research is value-free and objective. Research designs in qualitative research have a lot of these characteristics. First of all, they're naturalistic. Phenomena are studied in the real world, in the natural environment, not in a lab. So in, let's say, an oral history, we go to the narrator's home and speak to them in their environment. Research designs are emergent insofar as the study unfolds, the researcher can adapt, modify the line of questioning or the focus as the study proceeds. And perhaps the most important aspect of qualitative research designs is that it uses a purposeful sampling technique. The sample is handpicked by the researcher. It can be people, organizations, communities, whatever, even documentation. And people are chosen by the researcher because they can bring insight about a topic. As a result, the sample size is typically small. Samples are not randomly chosen, they're specifically chosen because they can give rich information, rich data about the topic. The researcher is not trying to attain empirical generalizations as you do with quantitative research. They just wish to reach a state of information saturation. In the example of oral history, after about 10 interviews, the 11th interview doesn't add much to the picture. So you know you've reached your saturation point. The focus of data collection in qualitative research, as I say, is to yield detailed, thick description, lots of detail. Data collection must be well planned, and it must be recorded, either on video, audio, photographs, or through copious notes made by the researcher. Methods include interviews, which are normally one-on-one and transcribed, recorded and then transcribed. Case studies, which would be observations. Focus groups of 5 to 10 people, where the researcher leads discussion using open-ended questions. Or document review, looking at diaries, archival documents, newspapers, reports, etc. Now, because the researcher is close to the subject or the data in the interview or the documentation review, their insight, experience with and knowledge of the topic or phenomena is an integral part of the qualitative research. The researcher must remain open, respectful, and neutral, so they don't add any bias to the data collection. And the researcher must be responsive, as the dynamics of the data collection can change. For instance, a focus group could stray off course, that the line of questioning leads to a bigger issue, which the researcher may not have anticipated. So they need to be aware that this could happen. Or let's say in a one-on-one interview, you may stray onto a very sensitive topic, and the narrator might shut down and stop speaking. So those are some of the things about data collection that are important. The analysis of qualitative research data is non-numeric. It can be a transcript of an interview, audio or video recordings, or textual documents, which lend themselves to various types of analysis. And there are many more than these 5 that I mentioned, but these are the ones that are maybe more familiar to us. Content analysis, where verbal or data is classified, summarized, and tabulated and coded. Narrative analysis is the reformulation of stories presented by the respondents to take what they've said and turn it into an account or a story. Discourse analysis is teasing out or extracting themes and patterns of knowledge from naturally occurring talk or discourse in the data. A framework analysis involves several steps. First, the researcher has to be familiar with the data and then establish a thematic framework from that data, from the raw data. Then a coding schedule, how they're going to categorize the data, and then create a matrix, a chart of rows for the cases and columns for the codes or themes with the data appearing in each cell. And this allows you to compare and contrast the data. And it's really good for thematic analysis of qualitative data. Grounded theory investigates the process or action, and it's often one case with the goal of developing a theory grounded in observations, which can then be applied to other cases to see if they fit. I haven't gone into the actual methods of data analysis. It can be done manually or using software. And there are many software products available to assist with the data analysis. The major components of research designs, of qualitative research designs, and how you write up your research are, first, you have your goals, which could be the introduction to the paper. It explains the goal or purpose. What is the research problem? It should clearly present the goals of your study and the problems it addresses, and gives an overview of your main research questions and what issues you want to illuminate. It should have a conceptual framework, which can be also referred to as a literature review. It explains how your proposed research fits into what is already known. What is its relationship to existing theories and research? You need to explain your theoretical framework, concepts, assumptions, beliefs that inform or support your study. You should have a section which describes your research questions or hypothesis. State your questions. What is it that you want to understand by doing this study? Clarify how your questions relate to prior research and theory, to your own experience and exploratory research. What questions will you attempt to answer, and how are they related? And how do these form a coherent whole rather than just being random? In the methods section of your paper, you should describe what approaches or techniques you will use for your research design to collect, analyze your data. You need to explain what is your relationship with those that you are studying, how you chose the site and the participant selection, your sample. What were your decisions for sampling? What data collection methods you used, and what data analysis techniques you will use. You need to address also the validity of the research. What could go wrong? What methods will you use to address any validity threats? Are there possible alternate explanations to your decisions and to your conclusions? Are there, can you test the data by triangulation, i.e. use a different researcher to view the data, or other sources, or how can you apply these to a different situation? In the conclusion, you need to pull together what you wrote about, remind your reader of the goals of your study, how it contributes to the literature, discuss its potential relevance and implications for the broader fields that it is situated in. And in sum, this section should answer any so what questions that arise out of your study. What are the strengths or advantages of qualitative methods? Well, the first one is that you can study a topic in rich, great detail, especially complex situations which require deeper insight. The research framework is fluid. It can be adapted and changed, which is unlike a quantitative questionnaire, which once it's fixed, it's fixed. Qualitative methods are based on human experiences and observations. It allows the researcher to present a realistic view or opinions rather than data on what's empirically known. The data has a predictive quality. In other words, the researcher has an idea about where the research is going. The line of questioning can be adapted and changed as needed if the circumstances dictate. Research is open-ended. In other words, you can revert to the interviewee or to the documents you were reviewing for clarification, to review again what was said or what was written. The data provides insights into authentic experience. It provides a holistic view of a phenomena being investigated. And the data can explain attitudes, give new ways of understanding a phenomena or a new worldview. The limitations of qualitative methods are sometimes said to be their strengths as well. First of all, the data is highly subjective and highly personal. It's not empirical, so the results from your study cannot be universally applied. The data validity is hard to assess because it's inherently subjective. And the interpretations of the data are the result of researcher decisions regarding collection and analysis. The volume of data collected can often be overwhelming, and analyzing that data is time-consuming and labor-intensive, and it may be difficult to break it down into more manageable bits. Again, I mentioned that you can use software to assist with that. The researcher can influence in a negative way the data collection. Researcher bias can influence, such as cutting off someone in an interview, in the interpretation and reporting of the data, or disregarding documents that don't fit the question. So that's always a problem with qualitative methods. It's difficult to replicate results the way that you can replicate results in a quantitative research. The very nature of qualitative research is its subjectivity, especially studies that are based on opinion or judgment. might be difficult to replicate to get the same answers. The small sample size is often cited as a limitation. A qualitative research is not meant to be extrapolated for the entire population, so it's not representative. It's only for that small group. Because of the enmeshment of the researcher and the subject, there needs to be trust, particularly between people, so that the subject will give truthful, honest responses and insights. And the skill of the researcher is an important aspect. They need to know how to keep the questioning on track because of the process and personal interactions. It can sometimes be difficult to keep an interview on track, and they go off on tangents and tell stories non-related to what you're trying to find out about. Like all research, qualitative research designs and proposals must be submitted to the institutional review board, because you need to get ethics approval, especially because you're dealing with people in a very intimate way. Quality, extra credibility can be attained by asking your informants for feedback on the interpretation of the data that you collected, or by being able to revert to them to clarify responses. Qualitative research can be audited. I mentioned before, the researcher needs to maintain meticulous documentation on how the data was collected and analyzed. One thing that can be done is have the coding of the data double-checked by an external researcher to ensure that it's similar between researchers and there are no biases are creeping in. In some qualitative research answers the why questions to understand a phenomena. The context of the experience of both the subject and informant, or informant and researcher, is important, as the researcher is embedded in the study. It uses a small purposive sample. Usually the subject is chosen by the researcher, and you only use a few people to do your study. You collect data until saturation. In other words, you don't try to collect hundreds of interviews on a topic. You only collect 4 or 5 like that. The analysis of the data identifies themes, patterns, theories to explain the phenomena that's being studied. And as with all research, you need to get ethical approval from the institutional IRB. So, as I mentioned before, there is software. I haven't discussed it. There are products available on the market that can make coding and thematic analysis easier for large quantities of data. And so, both methods are valid and useful. Qualitative research is used a lot in ethnology, market research, oral history, document reviews, and that kind of thing. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Virginia. The next slides is basically showing you some of the resources that we have in the UB library, and also some of the online sources that we have. So please, when you have the chance, go through them and see whether any of these resources can actually help you. So, so this session, I hope, is assisting you in trying to structure a good presentation, a good publication. So if you have any further question, you can ask me in the chat, or you can even raise your hand. Let me look at the chat. The resources for the session today, the presentation slides, and also the recording of the session, as long as you're registered, we will actually email to you. If in any event that you did not get any of our slides or presentation, please email us at research@ub.edu.bs requesting for the slides, and we will actually send it to you. Is there any question? Let me see. Appears quantitative research is more effective than qualitative research. Not really. It's true, as what Ms. Ballance have said as well, and so what I've said. It doesn't. Quantitative research is not. It's not to say more effective. It is two different approach of carrying out the research. If you ask a qualitative researcher, he or she will say their approach is the best, and if you ask a quantitative person, it may be the other way around. So there is no right or wrong. It's more of how you, what is your main aim of the study, and what do you aim to get out of the study. So the effectiveness will be very different. Yes, and you can see the response from Dr. Bethel as well. Effectiveness depends on what you want. Quantitative can show what, but it can't show why. Yep, you're right. As I've mentioned as well, it gives you the numbers, but it doesn't drill down to the details of why is the number saying that way. You just make an assumption by looking at the number. Wasn't there going to be a presentation for agriculture and tourism? Oh, I think that is for the next set. It's not in this session. That is the TDC UB webinar. The question from Alexandria. You are in the wrong webinar. This is the research method webinar. That is on Thursday. Can both approaches be applied? Yes, you can apply both approaches. If you look at some studies, there is an approach where you tend to use a mixed method approach. And the tendency is always to start with the qualitative research, actually. So based on the qualitative research, as I mentioned, you are building a theory. And once you have built a theory, now you need to test it. And you can go to the second part of the study where the focus is actually the quantitative research part. So that will help you. But at the same time, I see a lot of students who have actually worked on the graduate research. They struggle when they do a mixed method approach because they do a shallow work in both a shallow quantitative, a shallow qualitative, and then the findings becomes a big problem when they go for their defense of their dissertation. So I had a few PhD students that I supervised over the years, and I always tend to recommend them to choose one approach and do it well. You can have a bit of quant and qual in, but the substantial part of it must be one research method. If you try to do both, if you're really good at it, it's fine. But if you do not have the time, if you do not have the budget, and you want to finish on time, then it is always good to use one approach when you are actually carrying out the study. But you can use both the approaches. You can apply to ensure that your findings sometimes can be triangulated using the qual method, the different qual methods, and the different quant method. So it is good to use both as well if you have the budget and if you have the time. Let me see, is there any more question in the chat? Research lesson, okay. APA gives, yeah, Ms. Ballance. Ms. Ballance, you want to talk about the APA?
I was just responding to the comment that how numbers are written. Yes, that's an APA. It gives guidance on how numbers are written. If you're below 10, you write them out as words, and greater than 10 as digits.
What kind of research is often used for?
We will be covering that.
Yeah, we're going to be doing one session on APA soon as well. There's one question here for you, Ms. Ballance. What kind of research is often used for nursing students once on campus?
Oh my. I think we have some experts here as members. Dr. Campbell, for instance, I saw his name pop up. Typically, our students are asked to do quantitative research. So they get to use SPSS and learn about numbers, which is useful. But Dr. Campbell can confirm that or not. Thank you.
Yeah, he responded to say that we tend to use quant more.
Quantitative,
Yeah.
right.
How does discipline direct or dictate which methods to apply? Yeah, the tendency, if you see a lot of science-based research, experimental research is very much a quantitative approach that is being used, whereas the social sciences, the tendency is to use both qual and quantitative research. So it differs. Sometimes within the discipline, you can have different method, different type of research method. Even the social sciences, you have both quant and qual being used. Mixed method is being used. So so it is not just discipline oriented. It may be different from what is the aim. Because at the end of the day, what is your aim of the study? What is the research question, and what are you trying to address? So whichever discipline you are in, that is most important before you actually decide. So it depends on and what your aim of actually carrying out this study. Yes, the nature of study determines which method to use. Depends on the nature of the phenomena under the study. So you see all the responses that you get from the chat basically answering to your question there. Any further question, or anybody want to say something, or you want to raise your hand and say something, you're free to do that as well. We are at 1:30 sharp, so we are at the end of the session. If you do not have any further question, please feel free to email us as always, because we are always around for you to respond to you, whatever question that you have, even out of this session. So don't hesitate to contact us. So you just have a central email, research@ub.edu.ps, and then we will respond accordingly to, even if I can't respond to a certain specific method that you're using, I will still get some help to guide you accordingly. Okay, so with that, I would like to end the session today. I will see you again for the next session on Friday. So don't forget, you have been registered, so you can get access to the session now. So we have a list of all your contacts. We will send you another reminder, but please make yourself available for 1 hour on Friday. So until then, we will see you again. Take care. Stay safe. Bye-bye.